Who was Queen Elizabeth I, and why does she keep popping up everywhere? Firstly, when it comes to the monarchies of England and Great Britain, we have to distinguish between king and queen. A queen in England or Great Britain could only be a wife of the king or a mother of the king. She did not become queen in her own right. The last queen who ruled in her own right was Elizabeth I in the 16th century. Her mother was Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII. You may have heard of her as the lady in the famous painting by the Dutch masters, which is also the reason why there is a painting of her in your classroom right now. When Elizabeth was born, her father was still married to Anne's sister, Mary. And because Mary had a daughter named Princess Elizabeth, little Elizabeth was fifth in line to the throne. However, soon after Elizabeth's birth, Anne lost favor with the king and was executed in 1536 for alleged adultery and treason. Elizabeth, aged just 2 at this point, was declared illegitimate and stripped of her titles, banished from court, and forced to live a life of poverty. Her older half-sister, Mary Tudor, became the heir apparent and was groomed for the throne. Mary herself had been married to an ambitious young prince from Spain, but the marriage was childless and ultimately ended in divorce. So when Henry died in 1547 and Mary ascended to the throne, her half-sister, once the illegitimate child of the king, was very low in status and even further down the line of succession. In fact, when Mary was queen, she treated Elizabeth badly and threw her in prison twice. Once for falling in love with a dashing young courtier, and again for supporting a rebellion against her rule. This brings us to the first interesting thing about Elizabeth I, that she managed to survive in the treacherous world of the Tudor court. In order to get ahead at court, one had to be prepared to use every dirty trick in the book. And Mary had plenty of enemies, including her own sister. But Elizabeth somehow managed to make it through unscathed. And then something miraculous happened. Mary's only child had been born stillborn, and she had been unable to bear any more children. As a result, Elizabeth, much to her surprise, became the heir presumptive, meaning that she would become queen if Mary died without producing any more legitimate offspring. Ever cautious, however, Mary refused to acknowledge this and kept Elizabeth under close watch. Still, upon Mary's death in November 1558, Elizabeth was proclaimed Queen of England at the age of 25. She reigned for 44 years until her death in 1603. Her reign was significant because it marked the beginning of the modern era in England. During her lifetime, England went from being a poor, minor power in Europe to becoming a major world player. The country's navy grew vastly, the arts flourished, and explorers like Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe. Moreover, it was during Elizabeth's reign that England established its first colonies in North America. Therefore, besides being the last Tudor monarch, Elizabeth is also remembered as the first great monarch of the Stuart dynasty. And that brings us to the second reason why she keeps popping up everywhere. Her family tree was a bit complicated, especially towards the end of her life. As Elizabeth had no children, people constantly tried to find her a husband so that she could produce an heir. If you want to know more about those less than successful attempts, please check out our video about her and the 7 men who almost became her husband. In the end, Elizabeth never married, and the throne passed to her cousin, King James VI of Scotland. Became James I of England, and his son Charles, who had been next in line after Elizabeth, became Charles I. As a consequence, the Tudors ended with Elizabeth, and the Stuarts began with her cousin James. Another reason for Elizabeth's enduring popularity is that she has been portrayed by some of the greatest actresses in history. From the legendary Bette Davis to the incomparable Cate Blanchett. Many actors have played the Virgin Queen. Her story provided ample material for plays, movies, and TV shows, and she continues to fascinate historians as well as scriptwriters. Now let's look at what made Elizabeth I such an exceptional monarch. Firstly, she inherited a country that was exhausted from decades of civil war and foreign conflicts. Mary Tudor's policies were unpopular and had made the country poorer and more isolated on the European stage. Furthermore, England's traditional enemies, France and Spain, had formed an alliance. It seemed that England was destined to decline into irrelevance. However, Elizabeth turned things around and made England into a powerhouse once more. She pursued a policy of religious moderation, and sought to heal the wounds of the past. Remember, England had been torn apart by Mary's attempt to restore Catholicism. Under Elizabeth's moderate rule, people were free to practice their religion, as long as they agreed to follow three basic requirements known as the three articles of religion. The first article stipulated that there should be two kinds of sacraments, baptism and communion. The second article stated that the Bible should be read in English. And the third article asserted the supremacy of the monarch over the church. By pursuing this middle course, she won over most of the Protestants and even managed to avoid open conflict with the Catholics. Furthermore, she surrounded herself with excellent advisors and ministers, including William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh, and Sir Francis Walsingham. These men helped her to steer clear of foreign entanglements and gave sound advice. During the troubled times of her early reign, also, Elizabeth knew how to keep her distance. She famously called herself the artificial or wandering queen because she traveled all over her realm, visiting different cities and making sure that people saw her and experienced her as a living, breathing monarch. This touring was part of her showmanship, which included carefully choreographed public appearances and displays of pageantry, designed to impress both the English people and foreigners alike. For instance, her famous speech to the troops before the Battle of Tilbury in 1588, in which she rallied her soldiers against the Spanish Armada, is likely to have been written by one of her advisors. Speaking of the Spanish Armada, that brings us to another reason why Elizabeth is so popular. She decisively defeated the Spanish Armada, which attempted to invade England in 1588. Although militarily speaking, the conflict was indecisive. Spain had to abandon its invasion and return home. Elizabeth had been able to turn the English defeat into a victory by having the seas littered with wrecks of the Spanish ships. And since it was believed that the Armada was sent by her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had imprisoned for plotting to assassinate her, the victory over Spain ensured her popularity at home. Finally, Elizabeth's personal qualities made her an excellent monarch. She was intelligent, quick-witted, charming, gracious, well-educated, and knew how to use propaganda to her advantage. She set high standards for herself and demanded hard work from her counselors. While she liked luxury, she was also frugal and helped to improve the country's dire financial state. The Virgin Queen has remained one of the most iconic images of Tudor England. The myth-making started during Elizabeth's lifetime and has continued ever since. The truth is that the real Elizabeth was far more complex than the Virgin Queen image allowed. However, given the tumultuous times in which she lived, it is little wonder why this particular myth endured. Thank you for watching.